Divorced handyman discovered her fatal mistake and left her speechless. 5 minutes after the judge signed our final divorce decree, I stood in the blistering July heat of the Montgomery County Courthouse parking lot, helping my 11-year-old son, Jacob, buckle his seatbelt. The Ohio sun beat down, and my left knee, a souvenir from 15 years as an Army combat engineer, throbbed. This was not how I envisioned my marriage ending after 20 years, 2 boys, and building a life from scratch. My older son, Ethan, 14 and trying to act tougher than he should, climbed into the passenger seat of my battered Ford F-150. He slammed the door, jaw clenched, eyes on the dashboard. I walked around, slid into the driver's seat, and shut the door. For a long second, I sat there gripping the steering wheel, until my knuckles turned white. In my rearview mirror, the courthouse loomed like a monument to failure. It was twisted how a place could look so mundane, while your universe was violently dismantled inside. "Dad?" Jacob's small voice drifted tentatively from the back. "Yeah, buddy, are we still a family?" I stared at the worn ignition key. It felt like a punch to the chest. "We always will be," I said firmly. It wasn't a perfect answer, but it was the best I had. Nobody spoke as we pulled onto Interstate 75. The truck's old air conditioner rattled, and a faint country song played through a blown-out speaker. Normal sounds, but the cabin air was thick with unspoken grief. My ex-wife, Sarah, had walked out of that courtroom carrying the ultimate victory. She got the 4-bedroom suburban home I had spent years remodeling, the lion's share of our combined savings, and a financial settlement that made my attorney shake his head in disbelief. According to town whispers, she also walked away with the better story. She was the neglected, hard-working wife. I was the distant, emotionally unavailable husband. The marriage failed, she claimed, because I was just a glorified handyman who cared more about fixing freezers than my family. Honestly, there was a sliver of truth there. After the military, I started a commercial refrigeration and repair company. I came home smelling like Freon and grease, worked grueling 80-hour weeks, missed school plays, and told myself I'd make up for it later. But later arrived too soon. Suddenly, a loud notification buzzed from Ethan's phone. He glanced at the bright screen, his jaw tightening. Without a word, he unbuckled, leaned across the center console, and shoved the phone in front of my face. "You should probably see this," he muttered, voice trembling with raw anger and betrayal. I looked for 2 seconds, my stomach dropped. It was a group photo taken at an upscale local steakhouse. A massive table was crowded with jubilant faces. There was my ex-wife, glowing, holding a crystal glass of champagne. Surrounding her were her family, and right beside her, practically draped over her shoulder, was Greg. Greg was the wealthy, slick local real estate developer she fiercely insisted was just a friend until she abruptly filed the divorce papers. Everyone was beaming. The caption read, "To new beginnings, and leaving the dead weight behind." Clearly, an oblivious cousin accidentally posted it into the wrong family group chat. A careless blunder, a blinding, white-hot fury erupted inside me. I was furious they couldn't wait a single afternoon before throwing a victory party, reckless enough that my teenage son had to see it. Jacob leaned forward. "Is Mom at a restaurant with Greg?" Kids notice infinitely more than adults realize. I glanced at Ethan, who was staring out the window to hide his tears. I gripped the steering wheel, choosing my words carefully. "Your mom is making her own choices right now, buddy." Jacob nodded slowly. He didn't look convinced. Neither was I. We pulled off the interstate at a rundown gas station outside Miamisburg. The boys wanted drinks, and I desperately needed strong black coffee. In the checkout line, my cell phone vibrated. It was my attorney, Richard. I stepped outside into the oppressive heat. "Everything okay, Richard?" "Actually," Richard said slowly, his voice dripping with shock and amusement, "something extremely interesting just happened." I leaned against the brick wall. "What are you talking about?" "You remember that corporate trustee we discussed last month?" My pulse kicked into higher gear. Adrenaline washed away the fatigue. "Yeah, of course I do well." Richard paused for dramatic effect. "He just contacted your ex-wife's attorney. Directly, about 10 minutes ago. 10 minutes ago, exactly when everybody in that photograph would be toasting my destruction." "What happened?" I asked, voice deadly calm. "I don't have all the specifics, but..." Her attorney abruptly left the dinner table and took the call in private. When he came back, the party was completely over. I closed my eyes for 7 agonizing months. I had waited, 7 months of playing the clueless, defeated handyman. 7 months of quietly preparing for total, systematic warfare. Now the tripwire had finally been triggered. The trap I meticulously designed was snapping shut. "You okay, man?" Richard broke through my thoughts. "Yeah," I lied smoothly. "No, you're not," he countered dryly. I let out a harsh laugh. "No, I'm really not." When I walked back to the truck, Ethan and Jacob were arguing about which fast food drive-thru to hit. Regular kid stuff. I slid behind the wheel, desperately wanting to just appreciate the simple fact I still had my boys. But another, darker part of my mind drifted backward. 7 months earlier, to a dreary Tuesday afternoon, and a plain white envelope sitting innocently on my kitchen counter. If I had tossed it away, none of what happened afterward would have come to light. I would have blindly accepted the fabricated story, and genuinely believed Greg was the successful man he claimed to be. Instead, I opened it, and my entire understanding of my 20-year marriage was violently ripped to shreds. As we merged back onto the northbound lanes, the boys fell asleep. For the first time all day, the truck was silent. I glanced in the rearview mirror. My boys were the reason I kept breathing when my world felt like it was burning to the ground. Back at the steakhouse, my ex-wife and Greg probably believed they had won. What none of them realized was that Richard's phone call was not a stroke of bad luck. The final divorce hearing they just celebrated wasn't their victory lap. It was the final piece of a devastating trap I spent 200 days building. The real story started 7 months earlier, with a piece of mail and a fatal mistake made by people who severely underestimated the man they thought they had broken. 7 months earlier, my life appeared perfectly intact. Our 2-story house in Centerville had a meticulously trimmed lawn, and my faded work truck parked securely in the driveway. No visible cracks suggested a marriage tearing itself apart from the inside out. Disasters rarely announce their arrival. They seep in through the floorboards, poisoning the air slowly. I was 58. My second knee surgery had failed, leaving me feeling fragile. Our house's tension had become a suffocating physical presence. We weren't screaming. We devolved into cold, calculated silence. I wasn't innocent. My HVAC business paid the bills and allowed for expensive vacations, but it aggressively consumed my life. I convinced myself that being the rock-solid provider was enough. A fatal miscalculation. One evening, exhausted and covered in grease, I found Sarah sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling her phone. "How was your day?" I asked, dropping my tool belt. "Oh, fine," she muttered, never looking up. That was it, fine. A few years earlier, we would have eaten together and laughed. Now we operated like hostile roommates. Later that night, as the boys played and studied, Sarah sat in her armchair, endlessly scrolling, a genuine smile playing on her lips. She wasn't smiling at me or the boys. She was smiling at someone else. Exactly 1 week later, the envelope arrived, plain white, no company logo, just her name, and a return address from a boutique financial services office in Cincinnati. We utilized a local CPA and had no business in Cincinnati. I left it on the counter, but the next morning, my investigative instincts kicked in. I slid my thumb under the flap and ripped it open. Inside was a standard financial statement for an account I had never seen in 20 years. I sat down and read every page. The balance was a little over $28,000, enough money to matter significantly. By dinner time, anxiety was burning a hole in my stomach. I leaned against the counter and casually asked, "Hey, what's that account from Cincinnati?" Her head snapped up, panic flashing across her face. "What account?" she demanded, voice an octave high. "The statement," I replied calmly. The panic disappeared behind a mask of cold indifference. "It's nothing," she snapped, snatching the papers. "It doesn't concern you, it's a personal account." I nodded slowly and walked out of the room. The trust was permanently gone. A week later, I quietly uncovered a second hidden account. Then a third. The money was moving slowly, methodically, siphoned bucket by bucket. Realizing I was out of my depth, I contacted Michael. Michael, a retired IRS criminal investigator and forensic accountant, had a caustic sense of humor and was ruthless with numbers. We met at a dingy diner. After reviewing my folder for 20 agonizing minutes, he leaned back. "You want the good news or the bad news?" he rumbled. "Start with the good. You're not crazy, okay? Bad news? Somebody is systematically moving significant amounts of money out of your joint assets," he said. I felt physically ill. "Keep looking," I said quietly. "Dig everything up." Over grueling weeks, Michael meticulously uncovered a massive pattern of wire transfers and complex financial connections. One name repeatedly appeared: Greg. Greg was a highly visible, aggressively flashy local real estate developer. He drove a brand new lifted luxury truck, wore expensive watches, and posted photos playing golf at exclusive country clubs. I initially assumed my wife was funding him and choosing his bed over our family. Then Michael called me late one Thursday. "I found something. You need to see this in person." Immediately, the next morning, sitting in his cluttered office, Michael silently slid a stapled document across his desk. I read the pages, violently realizing a truth infinitely worse than I imagined. The missing money wasn't the biggest secret. Greg was. And Greg was completely, undeniably broke. Not skip a vacation broke, catastrophic, drowning in debt broke. He maintained the pristine exterior of an ultra-successful alpha male. But his financial structure was an absolute wasteland. Several high-profile development projects had stalled. Massive loans were critically overdue, ruthless creditors were circling, and private investors threatened legal action. "Are you telling me this guy is a complete fraud?" I asked, barely above a whisper. "No." Michael shook his head. "Fraud requires malicious intelligence. This guy is just a narcissist who violently spends money he doesn't have, hoping the next big deal will magically fix everything." That answer felt messier, pathetic, and wildly destructive. Michael pointed his pen at the highlighted sections. "See these specific wire transfers. They line up almost perfectly with the exact dates and amounts of money, systematically leaving the hidden accounts connected to your household." I stared at the numbers until they blurred. My stomach tightened into an agonizing knot. Any naive hope of a misunderstanding was completely dead. I drove home that afternoon in total silence, the radio off, my mind racing through thousands of tactical scenarios. My military training had taught me how to compartmentalize. You don't react to an ambush by screaming. You assess the terrain, identify weaknesses, and execute a counter-offensive with overwhelming, devastating precision. That evening, I found Sarah sitting outside on the back patio, scrolling mindlessly through her phone. The sun was setting behind the massive oak trees, casting a warm light across the yard. For a fleeting moment, she looked exactly like the woman I had married 2 decades earlier. That was what hurt the most. It wasn't the terrifying possibility of losing her. It was the brutal realization that I had already lost her, and she had replaced me with a hollow, parasitic shell of a man. I walked out and sat down in the heavy iron chair across from her. Neither of us spoke for nearly a full minute. The silence stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. Finally, she looked up, her expression a mix of annoyance and indifference. "What?" Just one word, "what?" Not "how was your day?" Just "what?" I looked her dead in the eyes. I could have completely destroyed her, right then and there. I could have exposed Greg's impending bankruptcy and unleashed hell. Instead, I opted for a different tactic. I needed to know exactly how deep the delusion went. "Do you think we're okay?" I asked, keeping my voice incredibly soft, devoid of anger. She blinked rapidly. For a second, she seemed genuinely, profoundly surprised by the question. Then she looked away, her eyes fixing on a spot in the grass. "I don't know," she murmured. That answer stayed burned in my mind for months, not because it was unusually cruel, but because it was the first honest thing she had said to me in a year. Over the next month, Michael continued his relentless digging. Every few days, my phone buzzed with another piece of the puzzle. The more I learned, the stranger and more sickening the reality became. One sweltering afternoon, while I was on the roof of a commercial warehouse repairing an industrial compressor, Michael called. "What did you find?" I asked, wiping sweat from my forehead. "Are you sitting down?" "That's never a good sign," I replied, leaning against the massive metal housing of the AC unit. "No, it usually isn't," he agreed. His tone immediately shifted. "Your wife isn't controlling this operation." I frowned, staring out across the industrial park. "What do you mean?" "I mean Greg is aggressively manipulating her," Michael stated. I tracked the communication patterns corresponding with the transfers. Every time Greg gets into severe financial trouble, a bounced check, a contractor threatening a lien, a missed mortgage payment, a massive emotional crisis suddenly occurs. He plays the victim, and a few days later, and mysteriously moves from your wife's hidden accounts to his. I felt something entirely unexpected wash over me. It wasn't the fiery satisfaction of revenge, it wasn't blinding anger, it was a profound, deeply depressing sense of pity. For months, I pictured them as equal partners in some malicious conspiracy against me. Instead, I was looking at a woman making increasingly destructive decisions, simply because she was desperately trying to save a manipulative narcissist actively bleeding her dry. A few days later, Ethan found me sitting alone in the dim light of the garage, staring at a wall of tools. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, his voice echoing slightly. "Just thinking," I replied quietly. He let out a short, humorless laugh. "You do that a lot lately." He grabbed a folding metal chair, dragged it across the concrete, and sat beside me. For a long while, we just listened to the steady drumming of rain hitting the aluminum roof. Then he surprised me. "Mom's going to leave, isn't she?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. I turned my head and looked at him. As I said before, kids notice absolutely everything. They sense the subtle changes in routine, the suffocating tension, the forced smiles. "I don't know exactly what's going to happen, Ethan," I said honestly. The full scope of the endgame wasn't entirely clear to me either. Ethan nodded slowly. Then he looked up and said something I will never forget. "If she leaves, please don't leave us too." I had to look away instantly, staring hard at the workbench so he couldn't see the sudden moisture in my eyes. I reached out and squeezed his shoulder tightly. "I'm not going anywhere, buddy, that's a promise." That single conversation became the absolute bedrock of my strategy. It was the sole reason I managed to stay cold, calm, and collected. My boys desperately needed stability, far more than I needed immediate explosive revenge. About 6 agonizing weeks after that conversation, Sarah officially initiated the divorce. There was no dramatic screaming match, no throwing plates, just a painfully sterile conversation across the kitchen island. "I think it's time we talk about lawyers," she said quietly, refusing to meet my eyes. "Is there someone else?" I asked, giving her one final chance to tell the truth. She hesitated. It wasn't a long pause, but it was long enough to confirm everything I already knew. "We've just grown apart," she deflected smoothly. I nodded slowly, my face an unreadable mask. "I see," and just like that, the grueling machinery of divorce ground into motion. For the next several months, lawyers dictated our everyday lives. Endless financial disclosures, tense mediation meetings, brutal property evaluations. She aggressively demanded the house. She demanded the vast majority of our joint savings. She wanted a massive alimony settlement. My attorney, Richard, was utterly furious. "You need to fight back," he urged me. "She's trying to clean you out. She's acting like you were an abusive monster." "Let her," I replied calmly. Richard stared at me like I had lost my mind. "Excuse me?" "Let her believe she's winning. Concede the house. Concede the savings. Give her exactly what she's asking for." Because by then, another massive, unseen development had completely altered the battlefield. A few weeks prior, I received a highly unexpected phone call from Harold Benson. He was the fiercely loyal, intensely private corporate trustee for an estate connected to my late business partner, Walter. 20 years ago, Walter and I built the refrigeration company from the ground up. When a brutal battle with cancer took him far too early, I naturally assumed our complex business arrangements ended with his passing. I was wrong. Walter had been a brilliant strategist. Before his death, he quietly established a massive, heavily restricted trust that contained significant ownership interests connected to future commercial developments. Harold Benson explained the situation with ruthless legal precision. The trust had matured. The assets were now exceptionally valuable. However, under the strict terms Walter established, the trust absolutely could not release any information or funds, while I was actively involved in a contentious divorce proceeding. Legally, everything had to wait until the judge's ink was completely dry on the final decree. Which meant I had exactly one strategic option: stay absolutely patient. Finish the divorce, keep my mouth firmly shut, let my ex-wife and her parasitic fiancé believe they successfully pulled off the greatest heist of their lives. The final hearing took place 3 weeks later. My wife walked into the courtroom looking absolutely radiant. Greg was notably absent. So were most of her family members. It was just her incredibly expensive attorney, me, and Richard. She believed she had executed the perfect crime, cleanly extracting herself from a marriage she no longer valued, taking the lion's share of assets, while secretly funneling money to a man she genuinely believed was on the verge of massive financial success. The judge asked if there were any final objections or undisclosed assets. Her attorney stated unequivocally that everything was in order. Richard looked at me, raising one eyebrow. I gave him a microscopic nod. "No objections, Your Honor," Richard said smoothly. "My client is prepared to sign." She practically lunged for the pen. As she signed her name on the final line, Irrevocably severing our ties, she shot me a look of pure, unadulterated pity. "I hope you find some peace," she whispered. "I already have," I replied, my voice deadpan. She walked out to immediately join her family and Greg for their premature victory celebration. Meanwhile, I was driving north on Interstate 75 with my sons, waiting for the precise, predetermined moment the trap would violently snap shut. Which brings us right back to the phone call. Harold Benson executed his instructions with the cold precision of a sniper. Exactly 10 minutes after the court officially recorded the divorce decree, making it permanent, Harold contacted my ex-wife's attorney. Later, Harold gave me a highly detailed account. The attorney answered the phone, clearly annoyed at the interruption during his victory dinner. He listened for about 10 seconds, before abruptly excusing himself from the table and practically sprinting out to the restaurant parking lot. Harold methodically explained two critical facts. First, by aggressively demanding a finalized settlement based solely on our currently disclosed marital assets. My ex-wife legally and permanently voluntarily surrendered any future claim to a multi-million-dollar commercial trust she never bothered to investigate. There was nothing illegal about it. She simply ignored the existence of my late partner's corporate holdings because she fundamentally believed I was a blue-collar handyman, entirely incapable of complex, high-level financial strategy. Second, Harold casually mentioned he was fully aware of several rapidly deteriorating legal situations involving Greg's failing development projects. As a major player in local commercial real estate, the trust held significant leverage over several properties Greg desperately needed. Harold politely informed the attorney that the trust would aggressively call in all outstanding debts immediately. By the time the attorney, visibly sweating and pale as a ghost, walked slowly back into the steakhouse and sat down at the table, the celebratory mood had violently evaporated. Nobody was clinking champagne glasses anymore. Frantic questions started flying. Profound confusion quickly curdled into absolute terror. When Richard called me from his car to tell me the news, I smiled, a dark, deeply satisfying smirk. I wasn't smiling because they were suffering. I was smiling because cold, hard facts were finally replacing their arrogant, fabricated assumptions. For months, they arrogantly believed they were the authors of this story. Now they realized they were nothing more than characters in mine. I honestly thought that would be the explosive end of it. The trust would secure my boy's future, the ex-wife would realize the magnitude of her mistake, and Greg would slowly drown in his own financial incompetence. I was wrong, because the very next morning, Greg vanished off the face of the earth. He didn't leave a note, he didn't make a tearful goodbye phone call, no frantic texts. He simply evaporated. At first, nobody thought much of it, but by noon the following day, my ex-wife had called his cell phone 12 times, all going straight to voicemail. By 3 p.m., she was frantically calling mutual friends, her voice trembling. By that evening, aggressive, angry people started asking very loud questions. The next morning, the situation escalated into a full-blown crisis. Greg's boutique real estate office was dark and locked. His executive assistant stood in the hallway, completely bewildered, having absolutely no idea where her boss was. Several incredibly angry, heavily leveraged private investors couldn't reach him either. In a town the size of Dayton, rumors travel fast. People swore he fled the state, was hiding in a cheap motel to avoid dangerous creditors, or was desperately trying to board a flight. Nobody knew for certain, but everyone knew the untouchable titan of industry had suddenly become very difficult to locate. Exactly 1 week after the divorce was finalized, my phone rang. The caller ID flashed my ex-wife's name. I stared at the screen. My initial instinct was to let it ring until it died. But we had 2 sons together. I took a deep breath, compartmentalized my anger, and answered. "Hello," I said, my voice completely neutral. For several agonizing seconds she said nothing. All I could hear was ragged breathing. Then finally she spoke. Have you heard anything from Greg?" Straight to the point. No apologies, just desperate, humiliating necessity. "No," I replied flatly. There was another long pause. "I just thought maybe." Her voice faded into a pathetic whisper. For the very first time in over a year, she sounded completely uncertain. She wasn't fiercely defensive or projecting that sickening arrogance. She just sounded profoundly exhausted and completely defeated. "I haven't spoken to him," I reiterated. That part, at least, was entirely true. The conversation ended abruptly. After hanging up, I sat quietly at my kitchen island, staring at the blank screen. I had expected to feel a massive, overwhelming surge of satisfaction. This was the catastrophic collapse I meticulously engineered. Instead, I felt closer to sadness. 20 years is a massive chunk of a human life to share with someone. Even after the profound betrayal, hearing her sound so incredibly confused and alone wasn't nearly as enjoyable as I imagined. A few months passed. The initial shockwave of the divorce and Greg's disappearance slowly faded. The boys adjusted far better than I feared. We settled into a quiet, comfortable rhythm. Wednesday night dinners, Saturday afternoon, trips to the hardware store, Sunday football games on the couch. They were incredibly small, ordinary things, but they were the foundational bricks required to rebuild a stable life. One Saturday morning, Jacob was helping me make pancakes in our new, much smaller kitchen. Flour was everywhere. At one point he fumbled the carton and dropped a raw egg directly onto my work boot. We both froze, staring down at the shattered shell. Then, almost simultaneously, we burst out laughing. Loud, genuine, belly-aching laughter, the very first I had heard from him in an incredibly long time. That specific moment mattered infinitely more to me than any courtroom victory ever could. Around that same time, the horrific reality of Greg's situation became undeniably public. Several major projects completely imploded. A local bank foreclosed on his beloved luxury truck. Former business partners aggressively distanced themselves. The pristine image he spent over a decade creating had completely disintegrated. Then, something entirely unexpected happened. About 8 weeks after the divorce was finalized, I received an invitation in the mail for the annual Montgomery County Children's Hospital fundraiser. Normally, I would have thrown the invitation in the trash, completely uninterested in playing dress-up. But this year felt different. Richard practically forced me to attend. "Put on a suit and go to the damn dinner," he demanded. I hated it when he was right. The fundraiser took place at a massive ornate banquet hall in downtown Dayton. I almost turned around in the valet line. A significant part of me despised walking into rooms where people mistakenly believed they knew the intimate details of my personal business. But Ethan, who insisted on tagging along, grabbed my arm. "Dad, what are you doing?" he asked, adjusting his tie. "I don't know if I want to do this," I admitted. "Stop overthinking," he commanded apparently. Profound wisdom occasionally comes from 14-year-old boys. Inside, the reception was jarringly warm. Several prominent local business owners clapped me on the shoulder. Absolutely nobody mentioned the divorce. About 30 minutes into the cocktail hour, I spotted her. My ex-wife was standing entirely alone near one of the dessert tables. There was no Greg, there was no victory lap. There was just a profoundly isolated woman holding a glass of sparkling water, looking incredibly uncomfortable. She didn't look physically different, but the confident, arrogant aura was completely gone. She looked exhausted, hollowed out by the crushing weight of her own terrible decisions. Dinner was served, the mandatory speeches began, and then something happened that I never saw coming. One of the hospital's senior board members stepped up to the microphone. He thanked the high-profile donors, then shifted gears, stating he wanted to recognize a few local businesses that quietly supported the hospital behind the scenes. My refrigeration company was the first one he mentioned. I expected a polite mention. Instead, the speaker shared a specific story. Years earlier, during a brutal winter, one of the hospital's main heating and refrigeration systems failed in the middle of the night. I had driven my truck through a blizzard, spent 12 grueling hours on a freezing roof replacing a massive compressor, and never sent them an invoice. "Some people in this town help others because they desperately crave attention," the speaker said, echoing through the massive hall. "Others help because they fundamentally believe it's simply the right thing to do." Several heads turned toward my table. The entire room erupted into sustained, thunderous applause. I felt my face getting warm, desperately wishing the floor would swallow me. But then, things became even more intense. Without any warning, Ethan stood up from his chair. My heart nearly stopped. He was absolutely not scheduled to speak. He simply stood there, looking incredibly tall in his dark suit. The massive room gradually hushed. "My dad won't ever say this himself," Ethan began, his voice projecting surprisingly well. I closed my eyes. Ethan took a deep breath. "This past year it wasn't easy for our family. You could have heard a pin drop. But no matter what terrible things happened," Ethan continued, his voice shaking just slightly with raw emotion, "he showed up. Every single game, every single practice, every bad day." I stared down at the white tablecloth, completely caught off guard, a massive lump forming in my throat. He never quit on us, Ethan said fiercely. Not once. The absolute silence that followed felt enormous. Then the applause began again. Stronger this time. A standing ovation. I slowly looked across the massive room. My ex-wife was crying, not dramatic. Attention-seeking sobbing, crying quietly, shoulders shaking, looking straight down at the floor, unable to meet the eyes of anyone in the room. For the very first time since the day I opened that plain white envelope, I truly understood something profound. This nightmare was never really about the money. It was never about the big house. It was never even about Greg. The real loss wasn't financial. It was the complete destruction of trust. A few days later, late on a Tuesday evening, there was a quiet knock at my front door. I opened it to find my ex-wife standing alone on the porch. No expensive lawyer, no arrogant family members, just her. "Can we talk?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I stepped aside. Sure, she walked into the house slowly, looking around. This wasn't the sprawling suburban mansion we had shared for years. It was a small practical rental in Springboro. But at my age, enough starts sounding infinitely better than more. She sat down at the small kitchen table, the exact table where Ethan did his homework, where Jacob left cereal crumbs. Ordinary life. I poured 2 cups of black coffee and set one in front of her. She wrapped her hands tightly around the mug, staring into the dark liquid for a long time. "I owe you a massive apology," she finally said, her voice trembling. I didn't respond immediately. I didn't want to offer premature forgiveness. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she added quietly. I needed to say it out loud. I sat across from her. "I'm listening." She took a long, shuddering breath. "When we first started having problems, I was just so angry. I felt completely invisible." I nodded slowly. "I know. And instead of acting like an adult, I started talking to someone who deliberately made me feel incredibly important," she confessed. "Neither of us said Greg's name. Then," she continued, a tear slipping down her cheek, "I just kept making worse and worse decisions. There it was, not elaborate excuses, just the unvarnished truth. For years, I imagined this exact conversation. In my darkest fantasies, I delivered some devastating speech that destroyed her. Real life isn't like that. Real life is just 2 incredibly tired people sitting across from each other, desperately trying to understand how things went so catastrophically wrong. I wasn't a great husband either," I admitted, my voice calm. She looked up, genuinely surprised. "You don't have to do that. I'm not doing anything but telling the truth. I worked entirely too much. I missed incredibly important things, not because I didn't care about you or the boys, but because I was an idiot who thought money was the only way to show I cared." For the first time in years, neither of us was fiercely defending our territory. We were simply talking. Eventually, she stood up to leave. She paused at the front door, turned back to look at me. "Thank you for taking such good care of the boys," she said softly. I almost laughed. "They're my boys. I wouldn't be anywhere else, I know," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. After she finally drove away, I stood alone on the porch. I didn't feel anger or a surge of triumphant satisfaction. I just felt a profound, overwhelming sense of peace. Some stories don't end with bitter enemies violently destroying each other. Sometimes the most powerful resolution is simply 2 people seeing the unvarnished truth, accepting the consequences, and walking away. A year passed, then another. Life became significantly quieter and infinitely better. The corporate trust matured, exactly as Harold Benson predicted. Financially, I was extremely comfortable. I significantly reduced my workload, selling a large portion of the refrigeration company to 2 hungry managers I had mentored. My knee improved enough that I could walk most mornings without constantly thinking about it. Ethan eventually graduated high school with honors. Jacob discovered a profound talent for woodworking and turned my garage into a perpetual sawdust factory. The boys spent quality time with both parents. Their mother worked incredibly hard to rebuild those damaged relationships. She didn't do it perfectly, but she did it sincerely. And Greg? He simply drifted out of everyone's lives, a ghost haunting cheap motels and broken promises. One cool autumn evening, about 2 years after the divorce was finalized, I sat on a wooden dock beside a quiet lake near Cedar Creek State Park with both of my boys. The sun was setting, the water perfectly calm. We had spent the afternoon fishing. Jacob reeled in his line. "Dad? Yeah, buddy? You seem happier," he observed quietly. I looked out across the expansive water. I thought about the military. The long years building the business, the crushing betrayal, the terrifying anger, and the difficult road back to this exact moment. I smiled, a genuine relaxed smile. I think I am. The explosive earth-shattering revenge I vividly imagined at the beginning of this nightmare never really happened. Nobody got publicly, physically destroyed. What happened instead was infinitely better. The truth came out. The liars faced the cold, hard consequences of their own actions. And I deliberately, permanently stopped allowing other people's terrible choices to dictate my peace of mind. That realization turned out to be worth far more than any courtroom victory, corporate trust, or apology. If there is one profound lesson I learned from this ordeal, it is this: you cannot always stop a malicious person from hurting you. You cannot predict the betrayals of the people you trust the most. But you, and only you, have the absolute power to decide what happens next. Sometimes, the most badass, devastating thing you can do to your enemies is to build a life so undeniably peaceful that their betrayal no longer defines a single second of your existence. Don't let anger trap you. Don't let someone else's greed destroy your foundation. If you've ever had to start entirely over after a devastating disappointment or profound betrayal, I sincerely hope you found your footing again too. Thanks for spending this time with me today. Stay strong, keep moving forward, and take good care of yourselves.